Hi everyone, Mitch here from CircuitStream. In this one, we're going to be taking a look at scene building basics in Unity. What makes up a scene, how we can manipulate the different elements that make a scene in Unity, and as well as a tour of the basic Unity interface. Let's get started. So we're here in a fresh project in Unity 2021, and this is what that looks like. By default, it shows this sample scene here. And what that sample scene looks like is going to be different for you depending on which template you chose in the Unity Hub when you were building this project. So I picked the 3D URP template, which gives us this really blank looking scene. But if you were to pick something like the 3D sample scene, for instance, the 3D URP sample scene, you get this sort of construction site sort of scene to take a look around, so that might be a good choice for you as well. And if you look at these different templates, there's a whole bunch of different starting points that you can take a look at for your project. But today we're just covering the basics, so we get this bare bones scene that's just made up of a few different game objects. So our hierarchy here and our scene view here both represent the same thing in different ways. Our hierarchy lists all of the game objects that are in our scene in a list format here, where our scene view shows where those objects actually exist in 3D space. And we can move our view around with the middle mouse button and pan our view with the right mouse button and use that to sort of navigate around our 3D view. We can also use our middle mouse button to scroll in and out. You should get comfortable with that sort of movement. I definitely recommend a 3-button mouse for working in any 3D software. Unity's no exception. If you're just rocking a trackpad, I would recommend buying a standalone mouse. But with just those simple navigation tools in mind, the middle mouse button drag, the right mouse button drag, and our scroll wheel, we can pretty quickly get around our scene by using a combination of those things and get an idea of where things are placed. So we have a directional light here and a camera here. You can see when we select our main camera in our scene view, it also highlights it in the hierarchy. Likewise, when we select something in the hierarchy, for example, our directional light, it selects it in our scene view because these are both two representations of the same object. You can see as we select these different game objects in our scene, something changes on the right side of our screen. Our inspector populates itself with the different components that make up that game object. So, for example, when we have our default camera selected, we can see that the inspector is populated with a camera component. And this camera component is what actually makes this act as a camera. Likewise, our directional light has a light component. And our global volume has a volume component. Something that all game objects have in common, though, is that they all have this transform component at the top, or some variation of it. This transform component is responsible for the position, the rotation, and the scale of this game object. So if we edit its position values here, we can see our main camera moves around our scene accordingly. So we can move it on the x-axis, we can move it on the y, we can move it on the Z. We can also rotate it on all those 3 axes. And if all these values get a little bit too crazy and we want to reset this component to its default values, we can hit these 3 dots up here and just click reset and it will zero everything out. So now our camera is in the middle of the scene. So it's at the origin of the scene, which is 0, 0, 0. Right now our camera isn't really seeing anything. You can see this main camera preview down here shows us what this camera is currently seeing. Right now it's looking at nothing, just a sky there. So let's make a game object that it can actually look at. And there's a couple of ways to create a game object. The first way is we can click our game object menu up here, and we could create an empty game object, which is just a transform component. But let's do something a little more interesting. We could make, say, a cube. Cubes are nice. And there we go. We can see our camera actually has that cube in its view already. If we pan around our scene view a bit, we can get an idea of what's going on. Our camera is facing this way. You can see its view is represented by these lines here. Another way to determine what this camera is looking at, besides this preview down here, is the game view. So if we change over from our scene view tab to our game view, then we get a view of what our camera is currently looking at. And what's really cool about all these tabs in Unity is that we can drag them around and place them wherever we want. So we can drag this game tab here, put it off to the side, and now we have this split view, and we can sort of see what this camera is looking at while still having some screen space reserved for our scene view. And so with that in mind, now we can move around our cube and, navigate in 3D space with our middle mouse button and our right click. And we can place that cube in the center of our view. And we can use these arrows here to move around our cube, manipulate it in 3D space. And we can see as we move this cube, it's also changing these values here in this cube's transform component. So it's just another way to do the exact same thing. A little bit more of a visual way. These arrows are actually appearing because we have the Move tool selected, which brings me to this Tools menu up here. So there is a selection of tools here that we can use to manipulate game objects and move around our scene view. Let's go over some of them. First, there's this View tool. It's just a hand that you can drag around your scene with. It's not used for manipulating game objects, it's just to manipulate the view. Might be useful if you don't have a 3-button mouse. Our Move tool is what was on by default. It allows us to see these arrows and change the position of our game object. What's this? Rotation tool. So this produces a little bit of a different gizmo. It doesn't have arrows. It actually shows these axes of rotation here, and we can manipulate those, move around our cube, and make it look a little more interesting to the camera. And we can use this scale tool to adjust the scale of the object. Once again, that's something that is covered in our transform component here. So all we're doing is manipulating these numbers, but with a visual tool instead of actually working with the numbers. But both are valid ways to manipulate a game object. There's also this one called the Rect tool, which is a little similar to scale, but you can sort of drag things out from the corners and the edges. Depending on what you're doing, this might be a little easier to work with than the scale tool. And now we have our manipulated cube in the view of our camera. So we've been messing around with its transform component here using these tools, right? But of course, because this is actually a 3D mesh object, it's made up of more than just a transform component. There's also this mesh filter component, this mesh renderer, and a box collider. That all comes on our default cube when we make a cube here. Our mesh filter is what decides which mesh this game object is going to render. So in this case, it's a cube, but we could click our little picker here. See this little target? When you see that, that means you can click that and pick something else from your assets. We can change it to a cylinder, or a capsule, or a sphere. We can just change the mesh on the fly like that. I think we'll keep it to a cube. And then our mesh renderer takes in that mesh and decides how it is rendered. So it ties our mesh to a material and has some settings for lighting. And finally, our box collider is something related to physics. This is what allows our cube to actually behave like a physical object and have things bump into it and behave like a solid object. Turning our attention back to materials up here, we can see our mesh renderer is set to this material here called lit. And we can see the current material, the settings for our current material down here, but they're actually grayed out. So if we wanted to change the appearance of this, change the color, we can't actually alter this default material. Instead, we have to create our own material and assign it to this cube to be able to change it. So we want to create a material asset. So an actual file on our hard drive that is a material, and assign it to this mesh renderer here. So how do we do that? So to make any asset, we have to come down here to this project view. And this project view is actually a representation of all of the files in our project. So these are all files that exist on our hard drive. So just keeping it in our assets folder, we can right-click assets, go to create, and we're going to look through this long list here and find something called material. There we go. It's named it new material. We can change its name to red. We'll make this a red material. And we can edit this material in the inspector. Just like how when we click a game object and it populates the inspector with the different components that make up that game object, when we have an asset selected, like this material, for example, it's going to populate the inspector with the options available for that material. So we can change these material options to alter the look of our material. We're not going to go through all of them, but our base map here has this color picker. We can click that color picker, change the color to red, and we can see in our material preview here, as we change the color, it is reflected in the material preview down here. And that gives us an idea of what this material is going to look like once we apply it to our cube in our scene here. So let's do that. So back in our scene, we have our cube selected. And remember over here in our mesh renderer, remember mesh renderer is what ties together our material to our mesh. Right now it's set to this lit. It's grayed out and we want to assign red to it. So we can go about this in a couple of different ways. We can click our little picker target thing here, and this will show all of the materials that are in our assets right now. And we could pick red like that, and that is valid. An alternative way to do it is to just drag our material over and drag that right into here. And it will change our cube to red. Look at that. How about we get another game object in here? Let's make a sphere now, and we can do that by going to game object, 3D object, make a sphere, or alternatively, we can right click in our hierarchy. Remember, our hierarchy is a list of all of the game objects in our scene. We can right click, go to 3D object, and sphere, and it's made a sphere. And I'm just dragging around my view here. Let's manipulate this. I'm going to go to the scale tool here and shrink down this sphere. Remember, we can see the scale changing as we shrink it down. Now I'm going to go to my move tool, and I'm going to use this cube as a little bit of a ramp. and just have this roll down the ramp. I think that'll look neat. If we look at the components that make up the sphere, it's very similar to our cube. The only difference is there's a sphere collider instead of a box collider, and our mesh filter points to a sphere instead of a cube. Other than that, they're almost the same thing. Let's make another material. We'll make our cube blue. So back down in our projects view, because we're going to be creating another asset, a material asset, we can right click, go to create, material, and we can just type in blue. We'll name this one blue. And I'll change the base map to something like this light blue here. We can move this metallic value to maybe make it look like a shiny metal ball. We can also alter the smoothness. So let's just drag this material on here and we have a nice shiny blue ball. That looks pretty cool. So if we want to see what happens when the scene runs, we can just hit this big play button up here. Let's see what happens. And nothing happens because there are no actual physics interactions going on in our scene right now. So how do we bring these objects into the physical world and have this ball roll down the cube? Let's go over to our sphere here, and we have to add something to our sphere to make it adhere to gravity and start moving and colliding with objects. And to do that, we have to add a component to our sphere. We have to add something called a rigid body component. So let's see how we do that. At the bottom here, there's this big add component button. So with our sphere game object selected, we can go to add component and we can search for a whole bunch of things. There's lots of different components that add different kinds of interaction in Unity. This is where you can add scripts and yeah, just a whole bunch of stuff. There's this physics tab here, and we're going to go over to rigid body, or you can search for rigid body. That's what I would normally do. But let's pick rigid body, and we can set a mass, drag, we can decide whether or not we want it to use gravity. We can leave all those things for now and see what happens when we press play. So remember, this is just our normal sphere with a different material on it. We've kept the collider on so it can collide with things, and we have this rigid body, so it's actually going to react to gravity. Now let's press the play button and see what happens in our scene and in our camera game views here. Whoa, look at that! Our sphere is falling into oblivion after sliding down our cube. Isn't that something? So that looks pretty cool already. Let's change around some of our game objects here and let's see how we can alter the values on these components to see how we can change up the look of this scene. So our main camera here, we didn't really dig into what actually is in this camera component here, but we can do things like change the field of view, which is essentially like zooming in. Rotate our camera a little bit here with the rotate tool. And make the camera angle wider and make it closer to the end of the cube so it looks maybe a little bit more dramatic. So that's how we can alter how the camera looks. If we check this physical camera box, we get a whole bunch more options that are related to how a real physical camera works. If you want a specific focal length, that's where you could find that. Next, let's see how we can manipulate our light. So our light component here, that's on our default directional light. It's set to directional, of course. We can change its color temperature here. So we can make the scene look a little more blue or more orange. We can change the intensity of that light. And we can decide whether or not we want things to have shadows casted from this light. A more dramatic difference, though, would be rotating this directional light. We can see as we rotate this directional light, it dramatically changes the look of our scene because this is the only light in our scene. So as we move this around, we can see how big a difference that makes and the variety of different looks we can get just by moving this one light around. Lastly, we didn't really touch on what this global volume is. This comes in the sample scene here. It's a way to add post-processing effects to your scene. So by default, there's a couple that are on. There's Vignette, which darkens the edges of our game view here. There's also Bloom, which blows out the bright parts of the image and makes it look bloomy. There's also tone mapping on, which doesn't seem to do much right now, but it basically remaps the colors of the scene. So if we wanted to add more post effects to our scene, we could click Add Override here. Let's do color curves, and we can just right click and say Add Key at Position. And we can make our scene brighter or darker like that as well. And let's play this one more time. Hey, and there we go. We've just built our first scene in Unity, manipulated some game objects, some components, and hopefully this puts you on the right track to making cool things in Unity. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time.